You're always welcome to do so. So I just wanted to redistribute because I added one or two makoros to that particular sheet. So I guess let's just distribute it. And while we do that, thank you so much, Joseph. I really appreciate it. Appreciate it. I just immediately sensed what the need would be. So the 2 points of machlokas between the Rambam and the Balei Tosos, in particular Rabbeinu Tam, Yonatan, were, remember the Gemara. Exactly. So the Balei Tosos say that the bracha is actually afterwards. They limit the principle. This is like a very fundamental idea of kol mitzvos mevarchin aleim over lasiyasan to when the person who's doing the mitzvah is actually the one who's reciting the bracha. And we tried to relate that back to our theory in the Rambam, that the idea is to direct the action towards the Kadosh Baruch Hu. But if you're not the one who's actually doing the action, there's really no reason that the bracha would have to be before. And that was a sheet of the Balei Tosos. And there's broad conceptual agreement here with the Rambam, but there was a very practical difference in terms of Birchas HaOros. You need a few more? Thank you very much. So we appreciate the hard work. So the Rambam's position on Birchas HaOros is that the person who does the Kiddushin makes the bracha, and of course that he should then therefore make the bracha beforehand over the Hashem. Did you not get? Yeah. Okay, and then the next point that we tried to tackle was this anomaly in terms of the Nusach HaBracha. Mark, do you want to remind us what was the Nusach HaBracha in the Rambam? Oh, a couple more? Okay, well great, because I have. Great. Okay, excellent. Mark, do you want to remind us the Rambam's unusual formulation? And he was sort of called upon to explain it in a tshuva. And he says, well, I'm not entirely married to it. No pun intended. Right? I could really go either way. But what was the missing word? Asher kiddeshanu v'mitzvosav. V'tzivanu was not present. It was just v'hivdilanu min ha'arayos. So that was really the last point that we were covering on Erev Shabbos. And sort of parallel to the argument that I was trying to make about the bracha rishon in the context of Kriyas HaTorah, here I thought that the specific tzivoy was, in terms of doing the mitzvah of Kiddushin, was in and of itself Havdalah min ha'arayos. And Avi brought up a really important parallel, one that I said I was going to get back to, and we'll do it today. What was Avi's parallel in terms of the other time that Sivanu is omitted?
I don't know.
Asher kiddeshanu v'tzosav v'ratzavanu. So I was going to try to make the argument that all of these instances are really where the Maisa Mitzvah is about much more than a particular tzivoy, but actually stands for something much broader. And I'm going to try to establish that in the context of Shabbos, very briefly, and try to establish that in the context of Mitzvahs Kiddushin. So Shlomo, just give me 1 second. I want to put the Rambam on the ledger. Okay, this is the Rambam in Ishus that I had in mind. So just take a look here. The fifth source, everybody has Makorus, and I reposted to Schoology. Let's just take a look at this is all familiar to you, because you guys have seen this, especially the seniors, their freshman year in the what we call Chazaras Hashatz days, maybe Yavin, that you guys remember seeing this Rambam. So the Rambam makes it very clear that his perspective in the midst of Kiddushin is all about V'ivdilanu min ha'arayos. Okay, who wants to do the honors? Okay, Joseph, take it away. The famous opening, Kodem Matan Torah, Hilchos Ishus. The only other place where the Rambam gives the history lesson is, of course, Hilchos Chanukah. So here we go, the Hilchos Ishus and Hilchos Chanukah always bear that comparison. Kodem Matan Torah. So rape is not permitted. You can't. You couldn't just drag her. But imratzahu v'hi. And there was some basic standard. I mean, you couldn't do it in the shuk. But machnisa lebeso, okay, some modicum of modesty. So the Ram describes the mitzvah of Kiddushin as the watershed, right? That's the difference between Yisrael uvein ha'amim, and Yisrael when we were all b'nei Noach, and La'achar Matan Torah when we became the Mamlachas Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. It's all defined by the mitzvah of Kiddushin. Now we're not learning Masech the Kiddushin this year, but just Pater below Klum Yafshar. What does the Rambam say here in terms of what is it that distinguishes the process? The Rambam adds in a few words that you wouldn't otherwise have needed, but it's just so obvious what he's driving at. He doesn't just say that now Kiddushin is obligated, the Kinyan, but what does the Rambam famously say? The injection of which element? Excellent, Hillel. And what's the significance of that? It's meant to be contrasted with his comment about the pre-Matan Torah days where it was, Daniel? Excellent. Beino levein atzmo. The legalization of this process. It's a formal, legal, halachic process. It's a kinyan. And quite to the contrary of conventional wisdom and popular zeitgeist, talk about the kinyan as being something of an affront to the dignity of the woman involved. If you really understand where the Rambam has come from, the legalization of it, the fact that it is a formal kinyan, the fact that you do need edim, is all about the seriousness of this process, right? It's not just something that could be done willy-nilly. Okay, next Rambam. We'll just read the first few halachos here, where the idea of the v'hivdilanu min ha'arayos, in terms of that being the best way of describing the mitzvah of Kiddushin, just becomes so patently clear from the presentation of the Rambam. Atani halacha beis. Hope this is nostalgic for you seniors, as you guys are pretty much coming into the home stretch. Torah machzeras halachsanya shalom here. Tedin daraisa. Din daraisa. Right. So the Rambam in this, right, this is the famous Rambam in terms of Kiddushay Kesef. So it's just important to note the Rambam really equates all of them on the daraisa level. Ve'echad mishlosh dvarim ha'isha nikdes. So he just said likuchanelu mitzvah saseh shel torahim. So you have to. Everybody focuses on the seifa, but you have to know the ratio of the Rambam also, where the Rambam clearly says that all of these have a deoraisa status, but then he's mifaret. He specifies kesef shtar bia b'shtar min Torah. Kesef as an expansion of the din Torah is midivrei sofrim. Okay, that's very controversial. The Ravid objects. So what do you think the Rambam is doing here? The Rambam says something which you would imagine is a little bit redundant. Shlomo, how do you interpret? So as Shlomo was talking about when he entered class, is this merely tov hetev? Is this mere grammar? And so a woman happens to be called a mikudeshes or miureses? Certainly not. The Rambam's not on a grammatical kick. So what's the Rambam pointing out here?
Saying it's both klape the man, klape the woman.
Oh, excellent. Or I would say klape the institution. The Rambam describes the institution of Kiddushin, but then what he wants to point out is hiya nikres mikudeshes miureses. What the Rambam is trying to say is that it's a chalos. It's a transformative moment in the life of this particular woman. Okay, that's the significance of this kodem matan Torah la'achar matan Torah. She becomes chalos shem mikudeshes miureses. This is not grammar. Okay, the Ravid, of course, objects to the Divrei Sofrim point. A little bit further. Avi, just hang on 1 second. Shmuel, halacha gimel. Benases mikudeshes is chalos in the gavra, or in this case, the gveres. Okay, a little bit of inside information here. Nichlas ala beis bala, that's the Rambam's definition of nisuin, okay? Chayav says bezdin. Okay, very good. So that affects the change in the chalos, okay? Now, once again, the Rambam revs up the great machine. Rafi? It's exactly the same language. Now the Rambam is tying it all together. Perhaps only he could have. So, right, Imratzahu he previously was the marriage case, but the other track available to you was an isolated act of intimacy. No sin lascharo bo lo aim haderech. Yeah. Right, as long as you make it clear that your intent is not for marriage, right? And what's the difference here in terms of the presentation? When it came to Kiddushin, the pre-Matan Torah, I can't say Kiddushin, but the pre-Matan Torah marriage, the Rambam emphasized that it had to take place in the context of his... Exactly right, whereas opposed to here, it's Al Eim Haderech. Yehuda? Outstanding. Okay, go ahead, Rafi. Equally a chalos. Not mikudeshes or miureses, but this is Chalo Shem Kadesha, right? However, Mishanisna Torah, this track became unavailable to us. We can't have Bia outside the context of Kiddushin. Shene Amar, one cannot have this kind of area of life has been restricted. That's the watershed of what Kiddushin is all about, is restricting Bia to a particular context. Lefikach, therefore and only therefore, because of this transformation of Matan Torah, Kol Abo Elisha L'Shem's Nus, where there's no intent to be Mekadesh or through Bia, Eo ipso. In that very moment, she becomes a Kadesha. Now the Ravid objects. He says, I don't understand this at all. He says a Kadesha is like Rashi. The Ravid Rashi agree about this. That a Kadesha is, who remembers? Mikudeshes umezumenes liznus. She's available not just to this guy, but to all people. And the Ravid frankly says that, there's this intermediate category called a Pilegesh, right? The whole idea is Pilegesh, where you're operating without the Kiddushin, without the Ksuva. Okay, so the Ravid disagrees about this point, but the Rambam's unique shita here is that once that watershed moment of Kiddushin came along, it was a radical transformation of Jewish society, and that any act of intimacy, of conjugal intimacy, became restricted outside the context of marriage. The Ravid doesn't agree. The Ravid says that's the very concept of Pilegesh. But the Rambam doesn't see it that way. So I'm just building up the point, and now I'm going to hammer it home with this next halacha, and hopefully everything will emerge. One last halacha here, Mark. The Rambam immediately transitions. So he's introduced Kiddushin. He's introduced Matan Torah twice. He feels that after Matan Torah, any act of conjugal intimacy outside the context of Kiddushin is by definition renders the woman a Kadesha at that very moment. And you violate the law of Losia Kadesha Mivnos Yisrael. Go ahead. So what's the next halacha in the Rambam? The Rambam says, oh, and by the way, now that I've introduced Kiddushin, the Rambam introduces formally the category of arayos. So isn't it just so elegant that the Rambam's Birchos Ho'erusin, it's not just Vitzivanu ala Kiddushin, but what's the impact of that? What did Kiddushin achieve? Vihivdilanu min ha'arayos. It's two sides of the same coin. Right? Like we spoke about in terms of Asher B'charbanu Mikol Amim, it's not just a specific tzivoy of Kriyas HaTorah B'tzibur, but the Kriyas HaTorah B'tzibur is the vehicle through which we reflect on Bechiras Yisrael. Now, if there's, and this was Abi's contribution, it was an excellent one, if there's one other area where we have exactly that same construct, it's of course in the context of Shabbos, right? Nachrish Shabbos, Chayav Misa. It's all about Bechiras Yisrael. It's not a specific just a tzivoy of Zachar Yom HaShabbos Lakadsho, but the very fact that we have this mitzvah, and it is a mitzvah, is reflective of the idea Asher Kiddushanim B'mitzvosav Ve Ratza Vanu. It's all about not just Bechiras Yisrael, but I would say the Chibas Yisrael, the Ratza Vanu. Okay, so let's just put those Rambams on the ledger. Avi, these are certainly your just desserts, no doubt. You raised it. I guess my friend Elliot Schreier first did it as cousin's Tish, but then you did it totally independently, considering I think you would have been about 4 time, even if you had been there. So you want to just take a look at the 6 source here? Oh yeah. Oh, if you can't, if you're not feeling up to it, then I wouldn't. Dracha Darachei Noam. Right. Right. No. Does it bother you? Okay. Zachreyus Chiras Shevach V'Kiddush. Okay. All of these words need to be analyzed. this is vitally important. The Rambam actually references this halacha when he talks about the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And basically what the Rambam means is to say how this day is distinct from all other days, so the 6 days of the week. And hence, just for you, anybody who likes mathematics in this room will be able to take great pleasure in this. Since the idea of Zachreo, Zechira, Shavach, V'Kiddush, which is basically the Rambam's notion of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, as we'll see, the Rambam actually references this halacha, what mathematically follows? If the whole idea is to differentiate it from the days before and after, which is, by the way, what you're doing during Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, you're saying that this is the exalted evening, but from the Rav. So Yaakov, when would it really make sense to do that? Mathematically speaking. If the idea is to differentiate it from the days before and after, Shmuel?
Usually on the seventh day.
Right, no doubt, on the Sabbath itself, but Moshe?
Exactly at the moment.
Bichnisaso uviyitziaso. You highlight that by hitting exactly those interface points where Shabbos runs into the rest of the week. So for the Rambam, of course, Kiddush and Havdalah are part of the same Chiyuv D'Oraisa, but you just have to understand why that's so logical. Because when you inspect the Rambam's broader Shita, what it's all about is the idea of a day which is distinct from everything before and after. Okay, go ahead, Avi. This was your Heyarav. Zeh Nusach Chiddush Hayom. But not Vitzivanu, because it's not a localized tzivoy. But the fact that we've been entrusted with Shabbos is Eidos hi l'chol ba'ay olam v'ratza banu. Kivanu v'acharta. It's Bechiras Yisrael. And then very naturally, V'zeh Nusach Havdalah, which just picks up where Kiddush left off. You don't need to say Asher Kiddushanu Tzav V'tzivanu, because in essence, right, this is just a continuation. Go ahead. Baruch Atah Shem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. Bein Yisrael. Okay, excellent. So that was exactly the point, and I think that the Rambam's Nusach of Birchas HaKiddushin just works beautifully with this idea. It's not just a local mitzvah, but one that, as the Rambam described so carefully in Hilchos Ishus, was mabdil us from the Arayos, both from the reality of marriage, Kodem Matan Torah, and Kedesha. And then the Rambam immediately proceeds to start discussing Arayos. Halacha Vav, by the way, is Shnios Arayos. And you have exactly the same phenomenon when it comes to Shabbos. It's not a Shirkei Shabbos Ivanu, Lizkor as HaShabbos, but much more broadly, it's all about Bechiras Yisrael. The fact that we have been commanded Zachar Yom HaShabbos HaKadsho is a referendum on our singular relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so that was a point that I wanted to raise. Avi, you had a question.
I was wondering, can you explain the parts about why it repeats Mekudesh and Resa? Like why it's...
Oh, yeah, exactly. So what I was pointing out there is the Rambam is trying to demonstrate that it's not just that there is this mitzvah called Kiddushin, which is affected by a kinyan, but that it transforms the woman. He's not making a grammatical point that, if Kiddushin is done to a woman or Erisin is done to a woman, the proper way to conjugate that would be to say Mikudeshes or Mi'ureses, but he's saying that it's a transformation of this Isha. She's now an Isha Mikudeshes and Isha Mi'ureses. And that is a way of highlighting the difference between pre-Matan Torah and post-Matan Torah. Pre-Matan Torah, you can never speak in these terms. There's no such thing as a Chalosh Shem Mikudeshes, Chalosh Shem Mi'ureses. She didn't have a legal status. So I was trying to point out before is that even though people who have an agenda want to mock the idea of a kinyan, what the Rambam is saying is it's an elevation in her status. She is an Isha Mikudeshes, an Isha Mi'ureses. She's given a legal status through this transaction, which is a sacred transaction, Kiddushin.
Is that the reason why the special formulation of reference for Shabbos and for Raya, because there's a special thing about the Jews?
Yeah.
Aren't the non-Jews also commanded in Raya?
Yeah, but there's many differences in terms of what the parameters of Arayos are for them, number one. And number two, the idea that they don't have Kiddushin is the most important point, is that they have certain types of conjugal activities that are prescribed for them, a mother, or sister, etc. But the critical point is that we've been given Kiddushin. we've been given the positive flip side of that. Daniel.
Right. So the way you're formulating the whole like mitzvah of Kedushin, and then like talking about how it arrives like right there at the same time as Kedushin, like puts it together and kind of compares
Yeah.
the two. Could you?
Kedushin is the mechanism through which we were separated from the Bnei Noach and from the Arayos.
Okay, so are you saying then that like when you do Kedushin, are you saying that you're also fulfilling the mitzvah like of not doing a riot? What do you say?
Well, you're talking about Lo Sikravu, or what particular mitzvah are you referring to when you say the mitzvah of not doing Arayos?
Mitzvah Lo Sasa, like not to do any Arayos.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are many specific Arayos that are listed. Midaraisa, then there's this whole category called Shnios Arayos. And then there's this general azhara about not getting close. So Lo Sikravu Legalos Erevas. I wouldn't say that it's like a kiyum in that, but I would say the very idea of Kiddushin is to differentiate us from a way of life and a historical period, Kodem Matan Torah, as the Rambam says twice, where there were much lower standards. That highlighted by the Rambam's term, Pogeya Isha Bashuk, right? You're Pogeya, right? It bespeaks, at every level a casual encounter. Now, it's better than Al Eim Haderech for sure, because like I said, there's a modicum of decency of bringing the woman into your house, but Sinai is the defining moment of Yoni.
The reason why in both cases, like, we don't need to do anything, and it's because Hashem's Mavdosh Regayim, but that's the reason why that's so on to the Tivanu is because we don't need it there, because we're not there.
In other words, Tivanu would make it too local or too narrow. What we're really reflecting on in this Birchas HaMitzvah is the true function of the mitzvah, which is like the most ambitious and broad agenda. Both Shabbos and Kiddushin, and if my argument is correct, Kriyas HaTorah B'Tzibur are all part of that construct. So, in the former two cases, you drop the Tzivanu. In the first case, you don't even have the formulation of Asher Kiddushanim Mitzvosav. You have a Birchas HaMitzvah, but a very atypical formulation. Now, I just wanted to point out, in terms of the tour goes through the machlokas between the Rambam and the Balei Tosfos, which we spoke about. There's just one last line here in the tour that I wanted to highlight. So starting 3 lines from the bottom, Shlomi, do you mind doing the honors? Adoni Avi Harosh Zal.
Adoni Avi Harosh Zal. Katav Yesh Shekavdu Shetzarch Levarech Verchas Eres Yikodim Hakidushin Kedam Rinon Kol Mitzvos Mevarech Aleim Over Lasiel.
So whose shita would that comport with?
So that's not the Tos. That's Rambam.
Good.
The Yeshu Kavdu Shetzarch Levarech Achar Kedushin.
Okay, who raised that concern?
That was the right of it.
Excellent, Shlomi. I just was very intrigued by this last line from the Rosh. So what's that rationale? I think that's really important and supports the general thesis that we built through the Rambam and ironically through the Shita of Rabbeinu Tam, and now 1/3 makor to put on that ledger. So Mark, what's he saying before we analyze? That the impetus of Kol HaMitzvos and Varchan Aleim Over L'Asiyasan is specifically when you, this is the Rush talking, specifically when you reference the particular mitzvah. But if you're not going to reference the particular mitzvah in the bracha, so then that would give you license to recite the bracha afterwards. So I thought that worked very nicely with this idea that the goal is really to direct the mitzvah towards its true purpose. But if you're not referencing the mitzvah, so we might be a little bit more relaxed about that. Okay, I think it's a very fascinating svara that the Rosh raises, and certainly could be put on that same list of makoros that we have for the relationship. Again, that all started with the Rambam's equation between Birchas Haneanin and Birchas HaMitzvah, the Rav in the direction of Matir. We've been trying to avoid that by reformulating it as a way of acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the either in the case of Berachas Hanen as the true source of this Hana, in the case of Berachas HaMitzvah to direct the religious act towards a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So if you're not referencing the religious act, you might not have to be mevarich over Lasiyas and Shlomi. Go ahead.
Wait, so why isn't there Karas Lasiyas HaMitzvah in the Berachas Kedushin?
Remember, in the standard formulation, you don't have it. It doesn't say Lakadesh Soisha.
Oh, right.
Right. I mean, again, the Rosh himself felt that it was appropriate to add in Al Yidei Chuppah V'Kiddushin in the end, but in the standard formulation, you don't find that. Okay, very good. So now that will now allow us to really enter the primary Rishonim on the topic, and we are going to be focusing heavily on the Rosh, the Rif, the Ran, the Bala Ma'ar, and the Ar Zarua over the course of the next 3 days or so. And then, as I think I posted to Schoology back on Thursday, we should, and if it takes us a little longer, that's okay. We'll get to it. Oh, we don't have Friday. Okay, so on Thursday we're gonna go through the this vast machlokas between the Rambam and the Ravid in Hilchos Brachos Perek Yud Aleph. Okay, so let's start with the Rosh. The Rosh will probably take us not just the rest of this period, but next period as well. But it's well worth it because this Rosh really goes through the critical issues, and we will read the whole thing together. It's just very hard to dissect out sections here because they're all just absolutely critical. Maybe what we'll do, just in terms of reading, it's Siman Yud, by the way, in Perek Aleph, obviously, is we'll look for volunteers in terms of reading. Yaakov? Thanks. Well, first of all, let's make sure everybody has it? Okay. Okay, so that's an amazing first line. So Shlomo will get to you in 1 second. So Yaakov, what does it mean? That the Havamina was that you're not going to recite a bracha on B'dikas Chametz because Eina Kol Kach Mitzvah. Now the Karban Nisanel reads that. And sure, I agree with this. The Karban Nisanel says. The Karban Nisanel, you have that underneath. Oschas Eina V'Zeina Mitzvah Sasei Min HaTorah. That what the Rosh meant by that was this is not a mitzvah to say daraisa. You'll see why the Karban Nisanel read it that way in just a minute, but I'm not convinced that's what the Rosh has in mind here. Delo seima eina kol kach mitzvah kevan de'eina ella levores hachametz min habayis. What does he appear to be saying? That the Havamina is, and the reason the Gemara has to say that there's a berchas ha-mitzvah and b'dikas chametz tani is what? So you might have said it's just. Okay, so the Ran says that. The Ran actually says that because you haven't completed the process yet. But Hillel?
Just to get the chametz out. It's not
precisely that there's really no significance to the Maisa here at all. You're just trying to create a bias baduk. Excellent. I think that's what he's driving. I don't think it's so much the Daraisa, the Rabbanan issue. I know why the Karban Nisanel said that, but Hillel, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's exactly what he's driving at, and didn't know because it still integrates into the mitzvah. It still requires a bracha. Excellent. Yaakov? He means the end of the 5th hour, obviously. Lishitasa. That's why the Karban Nisanel said, and before it must have been that he wasn't referencing a mitzvah min Torah, but I don't think that's what the Rosh meant. Yeah, v'hu mitzvah min Torah, but the end tashbisu certainly is. K'dechsev b'yom harishon tashbisu armi bateichem, v'dashin la'el b'yom harishon hainu b'yadalad omer ani. So he's a Tosfos man. Tashbisu hainu sreifa v'lo tzivsa Torah l'sorfa l'achar shekvar nesar midi dehava nosar. Right, that's where Rabbi Yehuda learns out in Bir Chametz l'sreifa from nosar. It's only l'achar yisuro. Aval ba'od. Okay, so now what he's got to justify is, so then why do we have the bracha? Okay, we understand what the Havamina was not to have the bracha. The Havamina is because it's really about just creating a bias baduk. There's no intrinsic significance to this maisa. Min haroi. Okay, go ahead, Yaakov. Al b'dikas chametz. Okay. So where does that come from? V'hainu she'enu yadu alo. V'al esek zeh. So when you put this sort of run, it's a long sentence, but what the Rush is really driving at is that so why do we make he's really answering two questions. Why is it that we make the bracha prior to B'dika A, and B, why is the Nusach not reflective of B'dika? And the answer to both questions is this is the beginning of the biur process, okay, which won't be completed until the next day, and therefore the Nusach HaBracha reflects biur chametz, but it's got to be made before the outset of the process. Exactly right. Excellent, Yoni. Okay. And then there's a really interesting question. Little shechianu? That would add some spice to b'dikas chametz, no? Mm-hmm. So nearly. Midi the Hava, this will be awfully familiar to you, gentlemen. That was the Gemara of Zayin Amid Beis. Remember, we spent a lot of time on that Shakla V'Tarya there. So Ella, in practical terms, we don't do that. Exactly right. We sort of fold it into the Birchas Hazman that we'll say in the context of women Lakas Neros, men in the context of Kiddush. We'll all put it in that context. So these are golden formulations here. He says, Kevan de mitzvah ena l'tzorech haregel l'takin abayis u'levorach chametz misocho, that it's intrinsic to the regel itself. And the reason that I like this so much is I'll give you a halachic expression. You'll identify it and then conceptualize it and then explain how that fits into the rush. Here's the halachic expression. Chametz u'matzah imo babayis. Jeopardy. What is Pesach Sheni? Correct. Now go ahead.
I guess he's trying to show that this is Tzorach HaRegel, but you have to differentiate Pesach Rishon from
Pesach Sheni, right, is how you could have a karban without a regel. Right? I always say that today is the parallel opposite of Pesach Sheni. You have the regel without the karban. Pesach Sheni is how can you have a karban without the regel. So that's exactly what he's saying here, is that the whole process of biur chametz is intrinsic to the din of the regel. And therefore it's legitimate to recite the Shachianu in the context of the regel, again, whether it's in Hadlakas Neros or Kiddush, man, woman, right? Because the B'dikas Chametz and the biur Chametz is all about the regel. That's exactly right. Chametz u'matzah imobai. Very important point. I just want to make sure that everybody.
Therefore, you should say Shachianu.
Therefore, you can the Shachianu that you make on the regel actually covers B'dikas Chametz. Conceptually speaking, according to the Rush, you do make a Shachianu in B'dikas Chametz.
When do you say Shachianu?
Kiddush or during Hadlakas Neros.
That's after you do
Oh, yeah. It's true, temporally speaking, but conceptually it covers the whole... Okay. So again, the way that we prove that that's really true, we're just supporting the Rush here, is the idea that it's the regel which is mechayiv, the biur chametz. V'haraya, when there's no regel, i.e. Pesach Sheni, there's no din of biur chametz. Chametz u'matzah imo babayis. That was that. Okay, Yaakov, go ahead. This is a fascinating discussion. Wow. Okay, so these are pretty rigid views here. She'en lebodek l'daber ad sheyigmar abdika, right? That you can't even talk at all. Okay, we're not talking about in between making the bracha and starting the mitzvah, but the entire time. V'yesh mosifin, and there are those who are even more machmir, and they say that if you do, then you got to start over exactly. And the Rosh thinks this is all a bridge too far. V'chol zeh ein nirah li. Ayeshiva sukkah. Now let's just pause here. Is that a good raya? It says like yeshiva sukkah. You make the bracha le'yeshiva sukkah. We'll return to the Rambam's Rambam versus everybody else in just a second. But is that a good raya, Daniel?
No, it's once you sit down, it's
okay, but you're still mekayim the mitzvah of sukkah. I mean, that's what he's driving at. So if you're allowed to talk while you're being mekayim the mitzvah of sukkah.
That may be part of being in the sukkah is having dialogue.
Excellent. Teshu kein tadura. The entire idea of being in the sukkah is it's your normal life, just in the sukkah. That's what I was driving at. Okay, so it wasn't really a fair raya that the Rosh is holding up, but okay. Lahatzrich lach, so the varech al sukkah. Ella. Ahanochas. Okay, so he says the only time we really find this is person who's sach bein tfilav has prevented the first bracha of laniach tefillin of being chal on the tefillin shel rosh. The Feirush Rabbeinu Tam, the Rashi Nami. Right, if a person only has one, or you only have tefillin shel yad or tefillin shel rosh, or more likely, a person can only be mekayim one or the other. Let's say they don't have arms, they can only be mekayim tefillin shel rosh, right? Okay, so he says really the only thing you have to be worried about is dibor between the bracha and the onset of b'dikas chametz. Tefillin is a separate issue because the whole point is to connect the two distinct mitzvos. Miu lechatchila. Excellent. V'im bal habayis. I happen to love this image. Ah, how great is that? So you have this. You imagine the people they've been practicing all of Nisan, and he gathers them together and he recites the bracha, and everybody listens and answers Amen and has kavanah to be yotzei, and then they're immediately mispazer to their pre-designated locations. How great is this image?
That was like the Rambam.
Mefuzar meforad. That's 20% of my chuckle. I mean, the image itself, 80% of it is just this incredible image, right? Of team b'dikas chametz. I mean, you get jerseys, and they just go. They go to their corners. It obviously has to be coordinated, right? The whole idea is that he's talking about l'chatchila, that there shouldn't be any sicha b'teila. Ephraim, you're not getting your instructions now for the first time. They've been drilling on this since Hanukkah, presumably. It's just terrific. Okay, go ahead. Al smach habrach shivarach balabayis nadi zesefta the brachos. Okay, so it's just Mirza Hashem by all of you guys one day to be part of such an elite B'dikas Chametz team. The Chief Justice gets to recite the bracha. Okay, so just to do chazara quickly on this incredible siman in the Rush, very briefly. Okay, so you really would have had the Nusach HaBracha being al B'dikas Chametz, it's just the beginning of the process. that will culminate the next day in terms of the beer. Number one, the shachianu is said, but it's said in the context of the regel, because beer chametz is a din in the regel itself. There are many machmirim in terms of very many machmirim in terms of not talking the whole time, which the Rush thinks is a good idea lechatchila, so you can focus. But basically, lahalach, there just can't be mafsik between the bracha and the beginning of the onset of the mitzvah. Okay, so we will pick it up there, God willing, in 4 minutes. Okay, Yaakov, very, 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 very nicely read. You went through the whole simon in the Rush. Yes, sir.
What happened if somebody?
Danielle.
Very cool.
Okay, Danielle. My mevarech. He has the same dosach as the Rif, so he reversed Rav Papi and Rav Papa. Don't worry so much about that. Rav Papa Amar. Nihilchsa. Modu. Okay, that it's gam al bir chametz and not specifically. So who amongst the Rishonim that we saw seems most open to that idea so far? Shlomi. Good.
Jacob Small, please come to the office. Jacob Small, please come to the office.
This is a fascinating concept. Mi berchosa shel adam nikar shetalmid chacham hu. It proves that you learned Daf Zion, because every Tom, Dick, Harry, and Sam would know that Levoyer Chametz is Lahaba Mashma, but only if you learn the Sugya and Zion, Amud Aleph, Talmud Beis, V'Hilchsal Bir Chametz. Can you prove that you are a Torah scholar? Okay. Nikar shetalmid chacham hu, v'yodea da'al bir nami lahaba mashma. They talked up Rav Zvid. They said he's an Adam Gadol. Baki bebrachos. So Amar lahem. So he said, I want to see it myself. Ki also, when Rav Zvid came along, Krivule Taka, they put a plate in front of him. They put the bread down. Okay. And he said, not hamotzi, but motzi. Amar. Question mark. He impressed you so much? Bishlami Amarlan hamotzi. He would be really teaching us through his brachos. El Amar motzi. My kamashal and motzi kulei amalo pligi. Everybody agrees that motzi has the proper meaning. This is a discussion in the Gemara brachos there, the proper way to formulate the bracha, but motzi is the obvious one. Alma. So what emerges from this sugya is l'kach nagu levarech ashmin and the gamzel lahaba mashma. Okay, an amazing thing. Okay, so this is the answer to the question that we've been wondering about the whole time: is why not just play it safe? Is that even though there's a general principle in halacha called histalek min hasafek, that's suspended in Hilchos Brachos. And in Hilchos Brachos, there's this concept that I wanted to open up for some discussion called Tzarech Adam l'chadesh b'birchosa, that when you make a bracha, it should be a way of teaching, in saying the greater chiddush. What do you guys make of that? And it's true apparently across Birchas Hananin and Birchas HaMitzvah. The Raya of the Gemara is from Hamotzi, it's from Birchas Hananin, and we're applying it to Birchas HaMitzvah. So how do you guys learn that? Donnie, how do you learn that? Well, what's the value added? When you make a bracha, it should be a big chiddush. Why? Rafi? What comes to mind? I don't think there's one right answer to this question. I'm just saying, how do you interpret this? Shmuel?
Maybe if you have a chiddush in a bracha, it causes people to discuss that bracha. It's more of a way of publicizing the bracha prayers.
But okay, fine. So let me just push you a little bit further. But what's the value to publicize? It's not like a pure sume nisa.
But maybe it gives people more of an idea, maybe of what the mitzvah is about.
Okay, I mean here it seems like it's more of a grammatical point. To be frank, that everybody should know that al isn't only l'sha'avar mashma; it's also lahaba mashma. Tzarchad mechadish v'chosav. Moshe, how do you learn? It's difficult. Hello?
Can you just explain what the difference is between motzi and hamotzi?
So yeah, the Gemara says the Gemara says is that one of the two. The Gemara goes back and forth. It's not obvious that you're referring to a Kadosh Baruch Hu actually bringing forth the bread from the ground for you. So the Gemara then concludes that motzi is clear. Motzi, nobody would doubt what that meant. But hamotzi is ambiguous. So by using hamotzi and saying, but even this formulation is a way of acknowledging that God brought the bread forth out of the ground, that's the one to make. And because Reb Zvid didn't do that, so Reb Zera is like, this is your Adam Gadol? Daniel?
Maybe we say like the whole idea of the brachos are to create a connection with Hashem.
Okay.
Therefore, like you.
I'm a believer in that.
Alright. Therefore, like I guess like motzi would really like cause you to be like a believer in Hashem, because like really like I guess like you see it more directly, you feel like more like it'd be more direct for you that like to hear that Hashem brought it right from the ground. So I guess
But reflect on it more broadly. I mean, what the Rashi is saying is this is not just an isolated din in Birchas Hamotzi Lechem Min Oretz, it's a din in brachos generally. Tzarech Adam L'chadish Birchosav.
I guess like when you listen to a Talmud Chacham like Vid, like I guess like his whole life was dedicated to become to Talmud Torah, which is kind of like doing a avodah to Hashem, creating connection with Hashem. So therefore, he kind of has a better idea of like.
Okay, so I think you're on the right track. I just wanted to sharpen it a little bit. Yehuda?
I guess I would say similar to Daniel, like based on the way the Rambam understands brachot. I think just the fact that the more specific you are in terms of thanking someone or realizing what they do, the more specific you are in saying what they did, the more you appreciate it. So I think like even if you could be Yotze saying Shahakol, I think if you say more specifically like Borei Pri, Hadama, like the more specific you are, I think it just...
Right, okay, so the Hakara Sato factor, but again, we're talking not only about Berchos Hanani, we're talking about Berchos HaMitzvah here as well. Shlomo?
Maybe you could say a little bit that, like, we were saying before, it's like connecting to Hashem. So we want to make sure that the person who's learning is not stam learning just like it's a chachma ba'alma. He's trying to show like like the chayt of people of Ayis Rishon, like they're just doing it stam chachma ba'alma, saying you're doing it to have a connection with Hashem.
So Berchu B'Torah Tchila, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's sort of like the same thing. It's like you're trying to show this person not just stam learning, he's a tam chachmi. It's like Torah gets into him. So
okay, yeah, okay. I need to try to invert that a little bit. Let me just get Yoni on Mark and Yoni on the ledger.
Yes, maybe there's just another aspect of brachos, and that they're supposed to be public in some sense. Like,
okay, I mean, there's definitely the din of bracha b'kol ram. Okay, I buy that.
Most people are supposed to make.
So that it's a way of just, but like you're saying that there's, I mean, that would be an absolutely fascinating idea, I have to say, if there was like this hidden pan, and maybe you'll write a Maimer Torah about it, I would love to see it, that brachos are actually a form of Talmud Torah also. That's basically what you're saying. I would love to see that. I'm not sure that I see the broader contextual evidence for that yet. So I'm going to go in a different direction, but don't give up on that idea. If you could establish that, that would be really outstanding. Yeah. Yoni.
Maybe it's what we were saying before, that brachos bring kamada to a mitzvah. It's that so the different lashon like brachos when it's very small, like hamotzi and motzi, it can make a big difference in the kamada mitzvah. So it's a big.
Well, but again, we're saying here that everybody would agree that motzi has exactly the same meaning. But hamotzi shows that you know the subtlety, that even that connotes that a Kadosh Baruch Hu brought this from the ground. Shlomi?
Maybe that you actually are kind of being mistelling yourself. You're clarifying that this is the right thing, because someone who Kol Hashana
like we said, maybe you're trying to clear it up for everyone else.
Okay, all right, interesting. I think it's some of you like we're circling around this point, but that Gemara in Menachos Mem Gimel Mem Beis that I've been consistently referring to, especially when we treated the Rambam Ve'atay Yisrael Ma'ashem Okecha Shol Meimach Al Tikrei Ma Ela Meya. So what are we really supposed to make of that Gemara? It's a strange Gemara. The Gemara, the pasuk in Parshas Eikev says Ma'ashem Okecha Shol Meimach Kiyim Liyiras Hashem Okecha L'Lechas B'Chol D'Rachav L'Avo Sol L'Davka B'Hashem Elokecha U'Avdo B'Chol Avchem. So there are 5 things there in that pasuk. So what does the Gemara mean? The Gemara, I thought, tried to explain that when a person makes Mea Brachos B'Chol Yom, so that fosters and facilitates all of those big 5 of Ava and Yira and Avoda and Dvekos and Shmiya. That is to say that, as the Rambam says, Kidei Lizkar Es Habore Tamid. So I think it's possible to suggest that when it comes to brachos, if the whole idea is to generate like this very deep sense of awareness of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's presence, so the general principle of Yistalek Min HaSafek is suspended in light of the fact that we seize the bracha as an opportunity. I wouldn't say to show off, that has the wrong connotation. Not to show off one's learning, but to demonstrate the intensity of one's commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as expressed through Talmud Torah. So that you're going to choose the bracha that most intensively reflects an immersion in the process of Dveikos B'Hashem. Only somebody who really, really cared would know to make the bracha Al Bir Chametz. Only somebody who really, really cared would know that it was also okay to say Hamotzi, because he learned the Gemara Brachos on Daf Nun, or he learned the Gemara in Psachim on Daf Zayin. So it's a way of highlighting the fact that one is immersed in the process. Ma Hashem Shochel Meimach Al Tikri Ma Ela Meya Tani.
That sound a little pretentious.
It does border on that. It does border on that. That's why I had to sort of catch myself and say it's not that you're trying to show off, but and you're certainly not. And maybe my defense here is that it's not like you're only doing this in public, right? If it were purely pedagogical in nature, that you're trying to teach other people, Shlomi, what's the correct bracha, you would say, okay, so let's be machalik between public and private. But we're not. So this is across the board. I don't think the idea is to prove what a big Talmud Chacham you are, but that brachos, by their very nature, are a referendum on a person's involvement in Avodas Hashem. So we encourage the person to say the bracha that reflects the greatest degree of involvement. That's what I'm saying. It shouldn't be like, you're grandstanding. It would be a terrible thing if a person, privately said motzi and then, publicly said ha-motzi, with the intent of showing everybody that he was, better than Rav Zvit. Okay. Geneva. Bilamid. Okay, now what has to be referenced at this point? The timeless words of the Ri, who basically threw up his hands and surrendered and said, I don't understand it to make it. So, in the end, I've told you many times that I think that he probably has the best answer to everybody, but that does not exempt us, V'yata Rashai Libatel Mimena. So let's now, we'll go through Rabbeinu Tam, we'll go through the Riva, we'll see all the theories that are out there. This is the famous Shita of Rabbeinu Tam. And like Rabbi Adler said, it only has approximately 17 exceptions. But Rabbeinu Tam said it deserves our attention. Rabbeinu Tam Zal, Hayanosein Tam L'davar. By the way, this is in the Sefer HaYashar. It doesn't appear in any of the Balei Tosos, so this is the Sefer HaYashar. Al, because happening right now, Al HaTfila, Al Netilas Yadayim, Al Achilas Marar, Aval L'Satef B'Tzisis Shihui. Meaning, what does he mean by the Shihui? Well, you're not hopefully going to wait before performing the mitzvah, but Joseph? It's ongoing. The Kiyum is ongoing. So where the Maisa mitzvah and the Kiyum are going to be achieved instantaneously, Dani. So that's Al Mikra Megillah. interesting. It may take you 40 minutes to read the Megillah, but it's not going to extend. Al achilas mar, al achilas matzah. This is Rabbeinu Tam's contention. It's his theory. But, with respect to those things that are ongoing, leishev basukah, who knows, I could be here for 4 hours. So that's the lamed formulation, to engage in this process. Okay, so, is that really grammatically what al and, I've often thought about this Rabbeinu Tam. You could have, made made the same distinction and flipped the assignment of al versus le, right? I don't know, it's like saying that there's something about saying al mikra megillah, which means that now it's happening right away, as opposed to that the kiyum is ongoing. But this is the theory of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, whatever one thinks of the theory itself, now let's get into the exceptions. Right, why isn't that, an al? It's got to last for a certain amount of time. You say, okay, fine, but Mikra Megillah is not going to be over before a half an hour anyway. So you're saying, okay, that's just a technical point that you can't read the Megillah that quickly. Whereas intrinsic to the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah is that it has to burn for a certain amount of time. Okay, fine. A very fascinating point. This is just in context a very famous line of Rabbeinu Tam that the primary tkiyos are the tkiyos de me'umad, okay, al seder habrachos, which creates a certain delay in terms of the kiyum. It takes a while. You just see how defensive you have to immediately be because there's just so many exceptions. Mashem mevarchen al kriyas halel. Okay, so what's his explanation for that? He says, when it comes to the Megillah, we read it straight, whereas intrinsic to the process of recitation of Hallel are call and response. Okay, so that's a minhag, it's true. Okay, so it's true that there's the minhag of that. He's saying intrinsic to Hallel is call and response. Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Yisrael. But let's be honest. Let's be honest. In proffering this answer, Rabbeinu Tam has moved away from his initial distinction. Like the kiyum is ongoing. He's not saying about Hallel the kiyum is ongoing. He's saying there's something built in the process that creates a delay. Rabbeinu Tam here is playing some pretty... He's scrambling. It's just very difficult to say that this fits into the original theory of where the kiyum is immediate versus when the kiyum is extended. This seems like an incredibly technical point that Hallel has this call and response built in. Not a very compelling argument. Really isn't. Okay. Excellent, Daniel. Let's have Yonatan. You want to take over? Yig'alu, when they will be redeemed. Okay, so now Rabbeinu Tam is thrown in like a sort of like a secondary line of defense into his theory. So the primary theory is al connotes the kiyum is instantaneous. Le connotes the kiyum is ongoing, fine. And he says, he knows that he doesn't really have an answer for Hallel, so what does he say about Hallel? He says there, the lamed is appropriate because it's a mitzvah which is sporadic in nature. The primary takana of Hallel is to say Hallel when there's some disaster and instead of the calamity actually occurring, HaKadosh Baruch Hu saves us. And for that, you can't say al ha-halal. We haven't been commanded to say halal, but it's likro as halal, as needed. Tani, I don't disagree. These are all fascinating distinctions, but whether or not it militates in the favor of al or li, or it's really consistently applied, is very hard to justify. Okay. You guys happen to already know Rabbeinu Tam's view of this, because you also know Tosfos Zayin and Aleph. This is all from the Sefer Yashar. Just nice to think about that. You're already at a point in your learning where you're able to confirm a Rabbeinu Tam and Tosfos with the Sefer Yashar. That's pretty good. Teda. Yeah. Yeah. It happens to be a very beautiful formulation of what he said in Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Mashem Mevarchem Mitzvon Tel Yad Lehaniach Ve'al Sharosh Al Mitzvah. Right now you're in deep trouble, right? Unless you have some fancy lumdus about the distinction between the mitzvahs of Tefillin Shel Yad and Tefillin Shel Rosh. This is like really, really not going to be a good, the kiyum of one is instantaneous, the kiyum of the other is instantaneous, and if the kiyum of one is ongoing, the kiyum of the other one should be ongoing.
It takes a while to wrap.
What's that?
It takes a while to wrap.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So let's see. Right, that actually happens to work with the lamed and the yud. So let's see. Let's go ahead. Umashem mevarchem v'tzon shel yad laniach chal sharosh.
Al mitzvah mishum delo ratzut chachamim l'taken shtei brachot zu achar zu v'mitzvah achad
Shavos.
Shavot v'chakanu b'shal rosh al mitzvah shehi commandments.
Okay, right. Now that. It's like, well, why not? Because there are two brachos affiliated with one mitzvah, they said, we don't want to be consistent about it. We definitely want to have two different nuschos. Hard to stomach. And indeed, for the Riva, look, the Rabbeinu Tam's nephew in closest Talmud, just came out very honestly and said, Lo masasi tam b'chol brachos. The Riva, next generation, the Balei Tosos, also wasn't particularly compelled by Rabbeinu Tam's idea. I mean, the idea of drawing a distinction between two very basic categories of mitzvahs, where the kiyum is instantaneous, the kiyum is ongoing, is a very powerful distinction. But whether or not we can justify al versus le on that basis, Rabbeinu Tam, even the way to say this is even Rabbeinu Tam was not really able to successfully do this. Now, what about the Riva? Okay, just one second, Avi. I just want to make sure that we at least get through the rush today. And then we'll circle back to you. V'riva, we're almost there.
V'riva, hayam chalik mitzvah de'efshar v'asarali de'shaliach mavari al aval mitzvah shehu be'atzmo tzarech v'asar tzarech mavari b'lamid.
So when we first learned the Gemara, we tried to raise this potential chiluk, right? And we're going to see the Ran tomorrow, and the Ran does a lot with this. And he says, and you see like echoes of this in the Gemara, right? V'zoi k'tas varas hashas delamu mashma. Ihu ma'il, right? That was the Gemara's initial assumption, that if you're saying lamul, it would imply that it's got to be you. The lamed is for when the chiyuv is inalienable; it's not subject to slichos. Now, notice that he has that girsa, not our girsa, of lishmo. There are 6 different nuschos of the bracha on shofar. So it's lishmoa bikol shofar. Okay, the Rambam explicitly rejects that. The Rambam says about that lishmoa bikol shofar sounds like we're supposed to listen to the tzivoy of the shofar, as opposed to hearing the kol of the shofar. Like you would talk about lishmoa ben sarah mora enanu shomeya bikol aviv bikol imo. Okay, so he has the nusach of lishmoa bikol shofar, because nobody can hear it for you. You can't appoint Yonatan. You're not going to be able to appoint Yonatan Srego, to listen to the shofar for you. Okay, now he's already playing defense. So halal, you certainly can, right? That's the whole premise of Shomea Kona.
אף על פי ששומע כהונה כמו גבי מקרא מגילה, כל מקום מצווה לנו בראשי הפרקים אף על פי ששומע כהונה.
Okay, that's right. So the you know the call and response. So that's not subject to Shomea Kona. Okay, so you're ready. The Riva is on playing some defense here. Ve'al hatvila, right? We can. Right, that doesn't seem to work out very nicely, right? Nobody seems to say, said the person who's tummy said, okay, Moshe, why don't you go to mikvah for me? Doesn't seem like it's going to work out. Okay, so Yonatan Srego want to take over. The ala tvila, he's got answers for everything. Avagav the tvilas tmeim yev shalasos lahidei shaliach. Kivan the tvilas kelim yev shalakayim lahidei shliach lo plug. So what's bizarre about this? Shlomi?
Didn't we have a low plug based on another case though?
Yeah, I mean we had that in talking about Tvila in general, but just let's key in on this svar. Joseph, what's bizarre?
Because by Kalim, he's taking your Kalim with the Chefta, your Kalim, he's being Tailored. By the Gof, it's not like, it's a completely different thing. It's like on the guy.
Excellent, right? So the idea that we're going to have a low plug from Tvilas Kalim to Tvilas Sagavra is just totally bizarre on many levels. Joseph pointed out in one way. I'll say it in an even simpler way, just if I think in a more advanced svara than I have. But the point is the same. Who said that Tvilas Kalim is the primary form of Tvila? That the low plug should be based on that and not the other way around. It's obvious that Tvilas Kalim is one little subset of Tvila. It's one case out of 100. When we talk about Tvila in general, the vast majority of the cases are Tvilas Adam. Right? That you make a binyan av on the basis of Tvilas Kalim? Meich Tesi. Just bizarre. Okay. Yonatan a little further. Yeah, apparently the Riva himself wasn't convinced by his first answer, so he throws in now the Tfilas Gerim. Okay, so for that always goes afterwards, so that's going to be Al. So he's basically saying the Riva's basic idea is if it's a mitzvah you have to do yourself, it's a lamed, otherwise it's an al. And there's also going to be all these other categories of al, even with respect to mitzvahs that you have to do yourself, if it's something that you do after you've already fulfilled the mitzvah. So al netilas lulav, al hatvila. Okay. Now he's in big trouble, right? Because lahadlik ner shel Chanukah, there's nobody who thinks that you have to do that yourself. It's chovas habayis. Orcha de milsahu. Okay, mitzvah ner Chanukah, mitzvah chaviv yarmod. Okay, it's the hadlik ner shel Shabbos, even though of course there's no chiyuv hagavra there. Again, the Riva ends up playing defense pretty quickly also. Right, what we is Al Sviras Omer. You could say, okay, Moshe, why don't you count the Omer for me this year? Shliach Tzibor. Yeah. So again, because the Shliach Tzibor has already been motzi a lot of people, so it's after the mitzvah has been performed. Fine. This is fascinating. We're going to see this in the Or Zarua tomorrow. Nimtza b'svar meduyakim. It doesn't say la'aniach tefillin or al mitzvah tefillin. It actually says a kitzan of mitzvah v'tzivanu b'mitzvahs tefillin. Wow, what an interesting nusach. Yeah. Right. So that actually is the gears of the Rif. He doesn't. His brachas mitzvah was not Asher Kiddushan Mitzvah V'Tzivanu Lasok B'Divrei Torah, which is all about learning, but Asher Kiddushan Mitzvah V'Tzivanu Al HaTorah or Al Divrei Torah is the exact nusach. In Ashkenaz we say Lasok B'Divrei Torah. Because it's a chiyuv that's mutal on the gavra and it's not subject to shlichos. Okay, so I just show you this is a very, 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 very famous shitos in the Rishonim. This Rabbeinu Tam and this Riva. And I'm just going to be very honest with you guys that I think it's very obvious to you anyway that these theories are, Rabbi Adler was very correct in the way that he described this particular, so again, certainly what motivated the Ri, but you know, the value of seeing these things, even if in the end of the day we're not going to necessarily be compelled by Rabbeinu Tam's Svara, the Riva's Svara, it is really important to think on a basic level about distinctions between categories of mitzvos. Whether that really explains the al-lip problem, doubtful. But the strength of Rabbeinu Tam and the Riva here is to really think deeply about the classification of mitzvos. There are certain mitzvos that you just have to do yourself, where the Torah says each individual just has to do this. And there are some mitzvos that, even if they're deeply personal in nature, kiddushin, are subject to shlichos. And one of the things that I want you guys to think about very much, at least for the rest of your lives, is this concept that, you know, there are certain things that just have to be done yourself, and then there are certain things that have to be achieved, but we're going to employ shlichos. And shlichos shel adam kamoso, and what the exact parameters of that are, and Korban Pesach, as we discussed recently, that I think is really worth thinking about. I mean, thinking deeply about, in terms of one's avodas Hashem. Why is tefillin part of category A, and let's say kiddushin part of category B? I mean, hardly anything can be more personal than kiddushin. I mean, you wouldn't say that, like, you know, netilas lulav is something that, like, is more transformational in terms of your life than kiddushin, and yet one is a mitzvah that's absolutely chovas hagavra, and the other one is, you know, subject to shlichus. So that's something that I do want you guys to think about in terms of the Riva. In terms of Rabbeinu Tam, no doubt that that's equally important, to think that there are certain mitzvos, whether the ones that he described as being on the list are actually the ones on the list is a different question. But in terms of mitzvos where the mais and the kiyum are simultaneous, that was his al, versus le, there are certain mitzvos that the maisa and the kiyum are not simultaneous. The maisa is engaged and the kiyum carries on and on and on. That's just something else that's really important for you guys to consider, you know, more broadly. So these are valuable chilukim and chakiros, even if it's, you know, doubtful that they could be used to explain the al versus le conundrum. But it is, again, something that I want you guys to be very aware of. Okay, Avi, you had a question from before. Oh, you don't remember? Oh, okay. Then I apologize. Okay, good. Shlomo.
You see, by the time you see that it doesn't look a bit time that it's the time holds over last siyasing. You say before the nigav yadayim. So he holds it's la'achar mitzvah tiyas yadayim. It shows there's no nigav as part of the mitzvah.
Yeah, that is a possible diuk. It's true. I mean, again, it could be that he just opted for one and not the other, but it's a point that's well taken. We're going to come back to that in terms of the run. So let's at least put the riff on the ledger. We'll take a look at the extensive run tomorrow, but let's take a look at the riff. So again, just don't be confused, because Rav Papi and Rav Papa are inverted in the riff. The Rosh picked up his nosach from the riff, so don't worry about it too much. But the same Gemara. Hill, want to do the honors? Rav Yehuda.
What honors is this?
Oh, this we have different pagination, but it should be Gimel Amud Beis, Dalet Amud Aleph, and the riff.
Rav Yehuda, Habodik, Tzarech, My Mevarech, Rav Papi, Mashmei Derabba, Amar Al Biur Chametz, Rav Papa, Mishmei Derabba, Amar, Mevarech Chametz, Vehilchasa Al Biur Chametz, Umibaile, Leinish, Lenuche Bereisha, Vahadar Badik, the Amar of Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Kol HaMitzvos, Kulan Mevarech Alein, over Asiyasam.
Amr Chista, Chutz.
Amr Chista, Chutz min hatvila,
Bilvad.
My timer, the
Kasi still Gavra lo Chazi. The Gavra cannot possibly make the bracha yet. Remember we saw Machokas Rashi versus the Balei Tosos. Rashi says we were talking about the Baal Keri. The Balei Tosos thought that we were talking about the Ger. Okay, so let's see how the riff comes down. Tan Nabi Hachi.
Taval v'ala v'aliyasahu Omer Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al haTefila u'mefarshei la Rabbanan v'tfilas ger bilvad Amar.
Okay, so the Rabbeinu Chanan, Gaon, Tosos approach. Aval
Sharach chayiv tfilas mevarchin v'achar kach totlin.
And I can prove it because Anida, who's mechuyevet b'tzivila, she has to go to the mikvah. Kotza lachalasa. The hafrish chala, she has to make a bracha on that. Zav, right? Certainly chayiv and tefillah. Nida again. Shechva zera.
Shrichin tefillah.
Upalta shechva zera, because they have this secondary issue. Halo ra keri v'lo palta shechva zera. Right, eventually they're going to need to do tefillah if they want to become tahor, but they would be able to recite whatever brachos they want. So the Rif is squarely in the camp of Rabbeinu Chananel and the Gaon and the Balei Tosos in terms of understanding what it is exactly that Akasi, Gavra, Lo Chazi really means. Okay, so just the major points in terms of the Rif is V'hilchasa al biur chametz, and the Rif, unlike Rashi, and unlike the formulation that we saw in the Rush before he started to get up to the idea of Tzarech Adam L'Chadesh V'Chosav, makes it sound like it really has to be al biur chametz, that it's going to be non-negotiable. And this is all because of the principle of Kol Mitzvos Kulan Mivarach Alein over Las Yasin. You don't get the impression from the Rif that we have the kind of a limitation that we saw in the Balei Tosos for the Tur. Again, the Balei Tosos limited to the question where the Mivarech was the one who was Oses HaMitzvah. You don't find that in the Rif at all. And the Tur had this idea is that it only applies when you actually reference the mitzvah. Remember we saw that today, the Tur quoting his father. That's only when the Nusach HaBracha actually references the mitzvah. But if you're not referencing the mitzvah, so then you wouldn't need to make the bracha over L'Asiyas. And this is kind of a purist approach of Kol Mitzvos Mevarchin Aleim over L'Asiyas, and by golly, the only example of a mitzvah that doesn't fit into this category is Tfilas Hager, because he literally cannot possibly say the words Asher Kiddushanim Mitzvosav V'Tzivanu Akasi Gavra Lo Chazi. It's the exception that really proves the point. So Mirza Hashem will pick it up tomorrow with the Ran, with extensive Ran. First, we'll take a look, just to be chronological about it. We'll take a look at the Bala Ma'ar and the Ar Zarua. Then we'll make our way through the Ran, who ultimately likes the idea that the Riva proffered, but there's just a lot of gems along the way in this very lengthy piece here in the Ran. Okay, so God willing, we will pick it up there tomorrow.